So, welcome. Thanks for coming. We're going to talk a little bit today about bots, payments, and feelings. Um, by way of introduction, my name's Nash. I lead operational strategy at Neuro, which is now an Experian company. And I've spent about 20 years in fraud and identity and payments. And through that career, I've built, architected fraud mitigation systems. We'll talk a little bit about some statistics. Experian does a study every year, and we go out and survey about 2,000 consumers, 200 companies, and so we have some really interesting findings from that survey. So I'll talk to you a little bit about our findings. And then we'll talk about the most interesting thing, which is how do you solve for some of the challenges that we see today with bots and fraud. That's my face. All right, let's start with some really top-level statistics. So, staggering numbers, over 1 trillion. This is last year. This year, we expect to almost double that number in terms of cyber fraud and scam losses. This is a global number. So, massive numbers at stake. About $160 billion out of that 1 trillion comes from the US alone. Now, the interesting thing is the FBI reported I think $16.2 billion in cybercrime and scam losses last year. And that's a big delta. 160 billion versus 16.2 billion reported. So what's going on? Well, the vast majority of scams especially go unreported. And part of that is consumers a lot of times don't want to admit that they've been scammed. There's this remorse piece going on, a little bit of that shame. And so that results in a lot of that being unreported. And then the other piece here is U.S. financial services the regulations haven't put liability of those scams on enterprises yet. So consumers take the brunt of most of those losses. A lot of times they go unreported. 59% of businesses said they've seen an increase in fraud. Not surprising at all. Here's some examples, some headlines, right? We've all seen these headlines in the public sector. These are just some examples out of hundreds and thousands of such examples. We saw the impact in the pandemic. We saw the SNAP fraud increase 55% just in the last year. This fraud and scams have affected every sector of the industry. Government and public sector is no exception to that rule. But let's see what's sort of the evolution that's happened over the last 4 years. We started a few years ago with stolen credentials. When you look back 3-4 years ago, the biggest problem in fraud in the industry was stolen credentials, ATO, account takeovers. Number one reported problem by both enterprises as well as consumers. We started to see, the pandemic came about, we started to see a number of data compromises. So everybody's data was breached. Last year, we had over 1,100 data breaches that were just the reported ones. And so with data breaches came exposed identities. 52% of US consumers said last year that their identity was used without their permission somewhere. And that's just, again, ones that were willing to admit. So that's 1 out of every 2 US adults. So stolen identities very quickly became the bigger problem. Now, when you have large amounts of stolen identities, what do you do with them, right? Fraudsters were starting to use them to commit fraud, but they quickly figured out that a much more efficient way of using them was using automation. When you employ a bot or an AI or a script, and you feed it tens of thousands of identities, it can efficiently go and apply them to a vast number of sites. Whether it's public sector, application of benefits or unemployment, or it's applying for financial services, a credit card, opening bank accounts, you name it. So bots and AI started to become a huge problem in the industry, still is. And when AI came about, it's made it really simple to create a really smart bot. I can actually go to ChatGPT and ask it to spin me up a bot that can take identities from a spreadsheet. Try this at home. I have. It literally takes seconds. Spin me up a bot, write me the code for a bot that can take input from a spreadsheet that has identity information and a set of forms, companies, enterprises online, where you can go and insert those identities. You can feed it a list of sites, you can feed it a list of identities, and it takes care of everything for you. It'll write you a pretty neat Python script written in a Selenium framework, and off it goes and does its thing. It's amazingly simple. So everybody today is a really smart fraudster that can write and spin up AI scripts all day long. So bots and AI became the tool, and the fuel to that fire was the stolen identities. Then we come to the world we live in today, where fraudsters have quickly figured out that there's economies of scale to be gained with fraud rings, as we call them. So concerted efforts by individuals acting as a cohort, using these tools and these stolen identities. And that's the world we're living in today. Bots themselves have evolved. They grew up. So they started out with simple automation scripts that were doing a repetitive task. Quickly, they morphed into bots that were running in headless browsers, and they actually could execute JavaScript. Generation 3 bots started to emulate human behavior. They started to operate in full-fledged browsers with proper headers, and so you could no longer just detect them using simplistic techniques. Generation 4 bots is where we live today. These bots are AI generated usually, and they can emulate human behavior. So at NeuroID, as an example, we study the behavior of bots. I mean, you take away the form and you just, for example, look at mouse movements alone, the human mouse movements look like a squiggly spaghetti mess, right? Because humans tend to doodle. Even when I sit at my desk, I'm moving my mouse aimlessly. And we call that doodling. And humans have erratic movements when they go move a mouse or a pointer on a form. Bots, on the other hand, usually were very low touch, low movement. And so fraudsters figured out that device fingerprinting technologies were picking up on this, and so they quickly morphed to train those bots with human behavior. Now, when you look at Generation 4 bots, they have more humanoid movements across the screen. They don't fill out forms in 0.1 milliseconds. Nope, they actually take their time, they make mistakes and correct them. And so it's no longer enough to have network level technologies looking at high velocity DDoS type of attacks. These are very application layer bots. They will hit your application layer, and they're trying to commit fraud by injecting identities or credentials into forms at human-like, in a human-like manner. Generation 5, which is on the horizon, and it's coming at us fast, is agentic AI. We were just talking about that, Janice. Agentic AI is probably going to be used by many consumers to start doing their tasks online. Starting with e-commerce, more than likely, because that's a simplistic task, but very quickly evolving to then do more complex tasks online for users, things like signing up for benefits, applying for credit cards, applying for financial services, bank accounts, lending, you name it. This is what a typical journey looks like for a consumer that's traversing through a standard sign-up process, right? We use BNPL as an example, buy now, pay later, but it looks very similar for most users that are traversing through an onboarding or registration process. You start by filling out certain pieces of data, and there is a number of forks that you can go down. Users tend to abandon at every step of the process because there's friction or there's steps they can't get through, etc. And this is your typical flow. When you look at what a bot flow looks like, these are trained bots. So you don't see forks. You see a large amount of identity data that the bot tries to apply. It gets to a certain point. Either it can get through or not. The pink path on this slide is where it got through, and then the rest of them got blocked by whatever tools and technologies that are out there, typically KYC, etc. So it's a very bifork process. It's straight, methodical, and you don't really see this picture unless you're studying the way a person is interacting with an online session. Here's what a bot attack looks like when you look at the overall population and traffic of an enterprise. This is actually a real graph from one of Experian's clients, and you can kind of see that the blue line here represents the human fraudster. The human fraudster comes in and they start to interact with the form. They're trying to figure out vulnerabilities. They find that path, the pink fork that we saw on the earlier slide, and once they have it, they're gone. The bot takes over. They've been programmed, and it just kicks in. And every single resource of the enterprise is now going in to stop that bot. And it's expensive, it's costly, and because there was no preventative measure ahead of the process at the top of the funnel, it usually comes in and enterprises are caught blindsided. All right, that's a little bit about bots and the current world of fraud that we're living in. Let's look at some of the findings from our identity and fraud report for this year. This is some really interesting data, so I find this fascinating. First thing we asked users was, where do you create accounts and how often do you create accounts, right? You can see the different industries on this graph. The ones that are highlighted, P2P services are popular with users. They create a lot of social media accounts, P2P accounts for person-to-person payments. But when it comes to things like government agencies, the number of accounts created obviously aren't very often. And so it's not surprising that that's far to the right. But what's even more interesting is this thing that we call the trust gap. So when you look at, let me explain what these colors mean. The purple line, let's start with that. The purple bar here represents how important consumers feel it is for that agency they're signing up with to protect them online. Right? This is the level of importance they place on that enterprise or agency to protect them. The blue bar represents what they actually experience and how much they're trusting that experience when they actually go to these enterprises and create that account. So you can see that on the very far left, this is government agency. There's a high expectation from consumers. They want the government to protect them when they sign up for an online service. Yet the actual trust that they're placing on the level of security that they're seeing is very low. And so that's the trust gap. And it's the largest that we see. It's the widest for government services. On the other end of the spectrum is P2P services, payments. They're doing a great job because the trust gap is very small. So the question that I always ask is why, right? And some of the things that we found is that P2P players tend to be early adopters of technology, especially fraud controls and security. And so a lot of times they employ technologies like the ones we're about to talk about that are passive, low friction, and consumers like that. Versus the other end of the spectrum where they're not seeing the same levels of controls and the same level of user experience. That is one of the hypotheses of why there's such a wide gap. So consumers want to be trusted. I think we've heard that through our surveys. Our consumers tell us this all the time. They want to be trusted. Trust for them comes in 3 dimensions. The first is they want to know how is their data being captured and used. So transparency is a very important key factor when it comes to trust. The second thing is they want to feel secure. They want to know that you've got the right controls, the right technology that's looking at who's providing data, and are they really the person they say they are? They want those controls on your site. And then the third thing is friction. They want low friction. I know these sound like at odds with one another. On one hand, consumers saying they want controls, they want security, they want to feel protected. On the other hand, they're saying they want low friction or no friction. Can you achieve both? Our answer is yes, and we're going to show you how. But these stats say it all. 65% of consumers say it's very important for them when businesses recognize them online. Again, this kind of comes back to friction. They don't recognize me, and if you do, don't place friction on me. Another way to say it is, a lot of enterprises go one size fits all. I'm going to throw an OTP at everybody who logs in, or I'm going to throw document verification for every single person that's signing up for something. But why does one size have to fit all? It shouldn't. Risk should be applied based on the level of risk profile that session or user is exhibiting. Control should be applied based on the level of risk profile. 40% of consumers say they're extremely trusting of businesses that do recognize them online. So they're placing a high value on that. So again, coming back to payment providers, these guys do it well. If you look at some of the more modern payment systems, the sign-up process is not the same for every consumer. The login process is also not the same for every consumer. They have controls that get orchestrated intelligently based on the levels of risk for that session. All right, so what are the payment providers doing better than everyone else? We kind of tried to probe this a little bit more. One thing that we found, I'm going to start with the numbers on the far right. We found that consumers started by saying, I like user IDs and passwords. I like them because they're low friction. Okay. And yet, when we said, how secure do you feel with just a user ID and a password? Almost everybody said, below 50%, said they trust just a user ID and a password. So the next question was, well, what do you trust, right? They placed very high value on physical biometrics. Over 75%, 76% of consumers said they like the security that fingerprints or face offer. 72%, very close second, said they love behavioral biometrics. We're going to talk about what is behavioral biometrics in a second, but this is a modern way, both of these really, are modern ways of authenticating users that passwords and user IDs alone cannot do. So, our organization's meeting consumer expectations. We went and looked at what are enterprises using today, and almost all of the answers were very expected. They're using standard, what I call, I hate the word legacy, I want to say traditional ways of authenticating users. People or enterprises use security questions and answers as a second factor of auth. Knowledge-based authentication, they're using OTPs that are delivered to either via SMS to phones or via email. And certainly, they're still very much using passwords. The use of technologies like behavioral analytics, passkeys, even facial recognition was low. It wasn't prevalent anywhere that we saw, especially in the public sector. So what do you do? What is the solution that we recommend? At Experian, we believe in a multi-layered fraud mitigation approach. Here is our theory of fraud mitigation. This is the answer. So we start with what we call perimeter defense. Perimeter defense does not look at person data. It looks at everything else. It looks at session analytics, things like device and device intelligence and fingerprinting, behavioral analytics. It looks at device location or user location and geolocation of that, session analytics as in velocities. Once you clear that sort of perimeter defense, you've weeded out a lot of noise. The other piece in that perimeter defense is bot mitigation. You don't want automation just hammering you with stolen identities, so perimeter defense guards against that. Beyond that, you get to non-sensitive PII defense. This is phone intelligence. Phone intelligence is things like tenure of a phone, type of the line that you've got. Is it a VoIP number? Is it a cell number? Is it a landline? My kids don't know what a landline is. I said that once in such a presentation, and one of my kids watched that video, and they said, "What's a landline?" I was like, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, just don't. So in any case, phone intelligence also tells you who's the carrier. It tells you when was the last time a number was ported, a SIM was swapped. And these are important details before you ever send out an OTP to a phone. Same thing with email intelligence. Email intelligence looks at how strongly is that person's name and other person details correlated with an email address. Is it seen in social media, as an example? The tenure of that email address, is it deliverable? Has it been seen in spam databases? Is there email tumbling going on, etc.? Address intelligence tells you similar things, commercial versus residential address, how long has the person lived at that address, etc. So that's the non-sensitive PII defense. By the time you get to sensitive PII defense, this is the expensive part of your KYC stack. Here you're doing full-on KYC verification based on regulation. You're doing your AML screening. You're doing credit checks, perhaps, if you're a lender. You're certainly doing sanction screening. So this part is required by regulation, but it's expensive. And if I were a bot hitting you with 40,000 identities, trying to do this 40,000 times can get really expensive really, really quick. So it's almost imperative that you layer your fraud stack in this way so that you weed out a lot of the noise up front. Then you get to transactional defense, as the name suggests. Now a person is moving money, they're making a purchase, they're actually doing something where a financial transaction is involved. And this requires you to look at things with a different lens, a lens of transactional models, velocities, senders and receivers, payment methods, payment amounts. And so you typically employ a machine-layered approach with a transactional model. And then the last piece there is authentication defense. This is repeat users coming back, logging in. They're maybe changing something on their profile. So how do you authenticate? And it's the ongoing authentication of users. And all of this is delivered through an orchestration platform. Can't tell you or stress more the importance of that orchestration layer, because it's what's the smart part about this process. You don't need every single one of these controls for everything. And the orchestration delivery tells you when to employ what controls and how you employ them based on the risk profile. All right, let's talk a little bit about perimeter defense, especially behavioral analytics. How a human interacts with a device is important. Think of an example where I walk into a bank branch, and the bank manager says, or I tell the bank manager, I want to open an account. The first thing the bank manager starts with, great, tell me your name. And I look in my pocket, I fish out a piece of paper, and I say, my name is Philip Jones. And then the bank manager says, all right, where do you live? And I go, 123 Main Street. The guy's going to say, you're reading off a bunch of information that's not yours. Now, when we went online, we lost that visibility. We can no longer see how the data is being entered. We know what's being entered, and it's all accurate because it's stolen identity data. So what behavioral analytics does is it gives you that visibility back. It actually tells you how was this data entered, and that's important. We measure things like typing, swiping, touches. Are you left-handed or right-handed? Are you flipping away from the screen, grabbing data and coming back and pasting it in? Are you chunking data? Because if somebody's name is a long last name, as an example, I don't know that from long-term memory. So I grab pieces of that data and insert it in chunks. And so we look at that, we look at pauses, hesitation, and this is a science that uses machine learning to take all of these signals and create a rich risk profile about the user that tells you how familiar is this user with the data they're entering. Is it theirs or somebody else's? And then it also recognizes you every time you come back. It tells you, same person, Nash usually comes in from Colorado, but today he's coming in from DC. That looks weird, but he's coming in from the same device and he has the same behavior. Or vice versa, if somebody came in with my credentials, but I used to be left-handed and all of a sudden I became right-handed, the thickness of my finger changed and how I type and swipe changed, you know that's stolen credentials, that's account takeover. And that's the power of behavior. Gives you a whole different dimension to see whether the data being entered is the real person or somebody else. It works across the ecosystem, starting with registration, but certainly progressing to repeat consumer authentication at login, profile changes, and at transactional payments. And it allows you to segment your users early in the process, right? New user comes in, measure their behavior with perimeter defense. It also gives you device intelligence, so it ties users and profiles to the same device. The same device coming in and creating 10,000 I-9 forms or 10,000 different signups, that's a problem. One device should maybe have one, maybe two, maybe three, but once it starts to exceed a certain threshold, that's problematic. Early filter, it weed out the bad stuff, weed out the bots, spend the money and the rest of the dollars on the rest of your process that's medium or low risk. Medium risk, you can add more friction. Low risk, maybe you fast track those users. So that's it in a nutshell. Behavior is an important part of the consumer journey. It's an important part of perimeter defense. NeuroID provides that technology. Experian acquired it about a year ago, and it's part of our portfolio now. As a whole, we offer all of those layers in that stack that you saw. We offer perimeter defense. We offer device fingerprinting technologies. We certainly offer non-PII defense. Or non-sensitive PII defense with phone intelligence, email intelligence. We offer KYC, AML screening with our Precise ID technologies, and then we certainly have an orchestrated engine that provides and delivers these technologies in a smart, orchestrated way. And we have one of the most sophisticated data graphs. We're the largest credit bureau in the world. We operate in 44 countries, so it's no surprise we have the largest data graph, and so we have some of the most sophisticated models that can deliver all of this and provide you rich signals. Thank you.